Hello, and welcome to the Tried It podcast, your proven pathway to a better copywriting business. I am one of your hosts, Sarah, and today I am here with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm the other face of the Tried It podcast. And today is an exciting episode, I think. We're discussing one of my favorite writers, Matthew Dicks, and his book is called Storyworthy.
Yes, this is our discussion episode. So Nicole and I have gone away and independently read the book Storyworthy by Matthew Dicks, links in the show notes to buy your own copy. And today we are going to be discussing it. And we just said minutes before starting recording that we haven't really talked about it with each other before. And we don't know how this episode is going to go. So we will all find out together.
See, this is in the interest of transparency, true transparency with the Tried It podcast.
So, Nicole, you suggested that we should read this book, Storyworthy, and you have said that Matthew Dicks is one of your favorite authors, but were there any other reasons why you wanted to bring it to the podcast?
Yeah, so I'll just rewind a bit just for some context. So this is like the third book of Matthew Dicks I've read, and it wasn't the book I started with. I also read, he wrote a fiction book, so he writes fiction and nonfiction, sort of books on the craft of writing, or maybe more specifically story. So I started off with a book called Memoirs of an Imaginary Friend, which I loved. Like, the story is amazing and I highly recommend it, and we'll probably also link that below. And then I read a book by his called Someday is Today. And what drew me to this particular book was my fascination with stories and wanting to be a better storyteller, because I think that that's how I can differentiate myself, and maybe how other copywriters can differentiate themselves, especially now, especially with this. I hate to say it. I feel like it's all I say on every episode, but it's top of mind. So with the fear of AI. So I think that's one of the things that really drew me to this book. And Sarah, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, to hear what you thought about it and what you got out of it.
Yes, maybe we should have some sort of listeners get to take a sip every time Nicole talks about her fear of AI, because I feel the fear too. And at least if we're facing the fear head on, we get to reward ourselves with something,
I would just think this is a segue, but I would love to know, if this is you, please tell us. If you're one of these copywriters who's like, I'm not afraid, I see AI, I'm vibing with this technology, it's all good, man, please let me know, because maybe I'm seeing things differently. But, that's a segue for another day.
Yeah, or come and join us in Fear Club. So you recommended the book, one of several books written by Matthew Dicks. I will drop the links for the ones you mentioned in the show notes. And as always, we like to kindly ask our audience to buy the books that we read on the podcast to help support the authors, because we wouldn't be here unless there were people writing books about copywriting in business so that we could analyze them. So if this gets you curious about Storyworthy, please consider buying a copy. So my first impressions of the book, after hearing you talk about him as a person, Nicole, I was quite excited to do it, because I have to say I went into it also with a slight air of skepticism, because I was curious as to whether he was going to tackle the idea of what actually is a story, because it's quite a broad term when you think about it. And I thought that, there are so many different things that could be stories. And if he's telling you how to make a better story, does he give you a framework of what that actually is, as well as how to do it? And I have to say, on that point, my curiosity was more than satisfied, because he begins by giving a definition of a story that I found both enlightening and very satisfying.
Yeah, and also quite, I would say, simple to understand and explain. So he talks about stories as kind of like a 5-second moment, I guess. And one of the key elements of a story is that there is this element of change or transformation that the person goes through. So, and it's important because, as Sarah said, it's very easy to confuse or conflate stories with anecdotes, or I think he calls it a romp. There are other things. Story is something else. Stories where someone starts off as happy and ends unhappy or something. There's this transformation that happens.
Yes, that they go in believing, having one set of preconceived beliefs about the world, and they come out with another, because they live this 5-second moment of transformation. And it's that's the difference between an anecdote, a funny story, a guess what I did when I was super wasted type story. Well, that's also a story, but it's not really a transformation.
Right. And, like I can see and I can attest to the power of this in my life. So I have an 8-year-old. And from time to time, we actually listen on YouTube. Like Matthew Dix has a lot of his stories on YouTube, and we actually listen to his stories. And my 8-year-old loves them. And sometimes we'll talk about them because they stay with you. Like there are these moments that really stay with you and somehow move you deeply. And that's something he also talks about, how a story is something that really it like lingers with you.
Yes, yeah, and that is because of the transformation. I didn't actually watch any of his YouTube videos. He mentions it quite often in the book. But do you think that they're worth seeing?
Listen, I mean, I'm very biased, but I really, I love the man. Sorry, in a completely professional way, but like I really recommend them. Like you just see like the craft of storytelling and how he brings things into life, and also you see like if you read the book, you'll see all the different strategies.
Yes, the book includes examples of some of his own stories. He does write novels, but he also competes regularly in the Moth, this storytelling competition, and he's won many, many times. So these are the places where he kind of brings his skills to life. And you mentioned that very important concept, Nicole, of the 5-second moment. And I thought that was a really interesting concept because obviously, my brain said, but most stories are longer than 5 seconds. They take longer to tell than 5 seconds. But he goes on to say that the whole of the rest of your story exists to bring those 5 seconds to the greatest clarity possible. And if there's a part of the story that doesn't serve that purpose, it has to go. So that's really kind of the foundation element of his technique as I see it.
So he has this concept, this concept of this 5-second moment, and then it's kind of like a story arc taking you from before to after. And then he talks about all these different techniques, which are how you smooth the arc, how you get the reader or the listener to stay with you, to make it believable, to connect with them. And something that really stuck with me from the book was he talked about, big stories. He's had a lot of very scary things that have happened to him, and the book is peppered with stories from his life. And he talks about how those scary stories of maybe a near-death experience being actually more difficult to tell, which actually seems counterintuitive when you think about it, because you would think that like a near-death experience would be the easiest story to tell. But it's for that exact reason that you have to find this authentic 5-second moment to really connect with people.
Because, as he says, most people haven't really had a near-death experience, and therefore it's difficult to relate to. And it's the relatability that really causes the story to stick in your mind, because you can think, oh, I've had a moment like that in my life. This message is therefore more universal and more meaningful. So he's very good at being able to find the moment, even within these big dramatic stories of nearly dying or actually being dead and being brought back to life. He's good at finding something else within that story that helps you to connect with it.
Right. Which I think is it's beautiful. And I think it's something that potentially all copywriters could learn from. I don't know if it would work with all kinds of copywriting, but I think especially if you're trying some way to infuse maybe an email or something with a story. I know it's something I'm working on. I think these are definitely good strategies in the book.
It reminded me of popular songwriting techniques because, a lot of songs are about love, different aspects of love. And I've noticed a lot of pop songs, let's say, All Too Well by Taylor Swift, like quite a famous song. She's singing about Jake Gyllenhaal and how when they very first started dating, she went over to his house and she left her scarf there, and then he kept it. And then even after their relationship didn't work out, he still holds onto her scarf. And then this is like the springboard for talking about something that's deeper and more meaningful, that you you're actually going always back to the same themes often of kind of connection or family or, thinking about your place in the world. You're just using different entry points. And these are the things that resonate the most with people.
Right. And I think you touched on something key. It's about finding the story under the story, about that, what we said, that 5-minute moment to come back to, or to build on, or to get a different entry point so people can really respond to that.
And then that brings us to the question of, okay, Matthew Dix has had a very busy life with many, many things happening. So it's super easy for this guy to tell stories, but I haven't had that life. I haven't had a near-death experience or, an actual death experience or some of the other crazy things that he's been through, because he also had quite a sort of disruptive childhood with a lot of trauma. Cool for him, or perhaps not cool for him, but how do other people tell stories when their lives are seemingly less eventful? And he has a number of techniques to discover stories in your life that you can tell using his techniques, which I thought was such a cool idea.
Yeah, and I think that's also, a really good point, because it's almost like a toolkit. So he has these 3 tools that you can use to sharpen your storytelling lens, to identify these everyday stories that we all miss, these moments. So the one is, he calls it Homework for Life, which is a beautiful, beautiful title. And he's actually also a teacher. Yeah. He's a teacher, so it makes sense. He's giving us homework for life.
He's also the world's busiest man.
No, he is. And if you want to get a better sense of him, read his book, Someday is Today. It really makes me feel like I've achieved nothing with my life. But anyways,
cool. You've done so much. We're here right now together, alive.
This is true. No, but he's like a productivity machine. So Homework for Life, basically it's the idea that every day you take note of a moment in your day. Could be the smallest moment that made your day stand out or different or special. And he recommends that you have a very simple spreadsheet, and every day you add the date and what happened. And because you want to make this as easy as possible, and you want to remove the friction, and you want to make sure you do it, it just has to be a one line. And in the book, he includes examples of some of his Homework for Life entries. And it's literally just like a footnote. Like, it's a footnote from that day. Kelsey, rain, sat in boxes. I don't know, something like that. Something that means something to him, so he can go back and almost like file that day and keep that day and preserve that day, which is a beautiful idea.
It really is nice. He lists some of the benefits of Homework for Life, and it's not just for gathering stories, although gathering stories is very nice and possibly important if you're a copywriter, creative writer. But I liked what he said about how it gives him the sense of having an accurate perception of time passing. I don't know if this came from the book, or I did also hear him interviewed on the Copywriter Club podcast, and I'll drop the link to that episode. But I think it was on the Copywriter Club podcast where he said that his kids feel to him the exact same age that they are. And I thought, God, that's such a nice thought, because I'm not a parent, but I've heard this so often from other parents that, God, they grow up so fast, and before you know it, they're walking, talking, and then suddenly they're in school, and suddenly they're teenagers, and suddenly they move out of home. And thanks to Homework for Life, Matthew Dix said that his children feel the age they are, because he's really taken the time to note down every kind of developmental milestone that they have, but not just the milestones, also the tiny little moments too. And I thought, wow, that's really nice. And obviously applicable to parents, but applicable to basically anybody who just looks and thinks, oh, wow, holy hell, like how has so much time passed of this year already? How are we already in Q2? Or how is it already the summer? That kind of thing.
I think it's very like 4,000 weeks-ish, because it's like makes you take stock of like what matters and like reflect on, time passing and what's happening with your time and how you're using time. Like, I think it's a different way of seeing your life, which is really inspiring,
It is, yeah. He acknowledges that Homework for Life is a big ask, and that it takes a little while to really reap the benefits of it. But he does outline the many benefits that he's got from it. He talks about how it's helped him to recover memories that he'd totally forgotten.
Yeah, I think it's really like it's a gift for yourself. He does say, though, that in order to do it, you have to have commitment and I think faith or patience. He talks about and how most people don't, and how most people just give up. And like in the interest of, again, transparency, I will confess that I started this. Like I started reading this book and then I stopped. And then we started reading it properly for the podcast. And when I read it the first time and I got to the chapter about homework for life, I opened up a Excel sheet and I have it saved and I wrote nothing in it. So, you really do need to commit and you need to have faith in the process.
I don't want to jump ahead to our implementation points, but...
Yeah. No, I...
Okay. Let's not spoil it. So that was one of his story gathering techniques. And possibly, I think it was the one he put the most emphasis on.
Right. And then the other two remind me of kind of free writing exercises, which I think were actually great. So the one was called Crash and Burn, which is kind of like a stream of consciousness that you have to write without stopping. And every time you change the subject, you do a slash. So it's kind of like if I see a plant, the pot plant, and you don't have to think about what you're writing. I think the only limitation is that you're not supposed to stop. And the whole point of this again is trying to unearth stories and trying to get your brain to uncover things. And then there's the third exercise or tool.
Yes. First, last, best, worst. I really like the sound of this one, actually. Not just as a writing exercise, but just as a kind of fun conversational game. In first, last, best, worst, it almost exactly what it says on the tin. You just take a number of topics, and he gives examples that are quite general, but you can go really, really specific. But it could be things like holiday, kiss, car, pet. First, last, best, worst. And you talk about a pet, first pet, last pet. And when I read that, sometimes the simple ideas are the best ones, and it made me regret almost, not that I particularly enjoyed teaching English as a second language, but I was like, that is such a useful exercise. Get your brain moving. And also it's a fun way to get to know somebody.
Completely. Yeah. No, I think it's a great exercise and it's a great potential game icebreaker. And maybe, I think all these tools could be really good for all copywriters looking to sharpen their skills. I've seen now, and I think, again, get ready to take a sip. I think it's a response to AI. Sorry. I've seen copywriters share these. What is it called? Something pig. Do you know what I'm talking about? The cards? No.
Oh,
I'll look them.
Moon pig?
No. I don't know. It's like you put two cards together and they're kind of writing prompts and then you have to write something based on them. So it's to try and get your writing muscles and get you writing. So it kind of makes me think of that. And I'm seeing like more and more of that on LinkedIn.
So with combining these three tools, the homework for life, crash and burn, first, last, best, worst, Matthew Dick says that even somebody who lives a quote unquote normal life, what is normal? But anyway, somebody who hasn't nearly died or been through the experiences he's been through will have an endless supply of stories. And then you take the ones with the most potential and using the techniques that he describes in the rest of the book, you perfect them and turn them into stories worth, performing on stage or turning into a book or however you want to use stories to communicate in your life or in your relationships.
Right. And the tricky part, in essence, like he talks about two things. He talks about identifying that, as we spoke about before, the 5-second moment, but then also finding the beginning. And he talks about how important that is because that's where you can lose people. And he says how the beginning is the opposite to the end. So you need to find your ending, decide on this 5-second moment, which is probably the end. What is the opposite of that? That's probably going to be your beginning. And you need to start as close to that as possible.
Yes, that was a really interesting point, which also brought up for me the other element of skepticism that I had about the book before I started reading it, which he also answered in a chapter that I loved, which was about the permissible lies of storytelling. Because as soon as you get into this concept of what is the beginning of my story, if we are accepting that stories that you tell about yourself are basically true, this is the premise, certainly of the moth, that you're telling true stories. As soon as you start talking about the beginning and the end, life doesn't work like that. It's not like you open a door and somebody is holding a sign saying this is the beginning of your story. No, you're actually making conscious decisions. And he's talking about making conscious and advantageous decisions, because when you pick the beginning, the opposite of the end state, you want to pick the one that contrasts the most with the end. And this is, I don't want to say lying, but it's definitely a manipulation of your life as you have lived it. But he does, as I said, he does give the 5 permissible lies of storytelling, and this is one of them. So I was like, oh, it's nice that you right. thought about that. Like, to what degree do you adhere to the truth in telling stories about your life?
And I mean, I feel like there's no other way to put this except to say a real trooper, because one of the points he drives home is that it's okay to lie or bend the truth if it's in service of your reader, as in not to make yourself look better, but to make the story easier for them to understand, to make it flow better, to draw the reader in. Like, there are ways and reasons why it's allowed, but to kind of invent things or things that weren't there, that's not allowed. Which I also respected, and I thought he dealt with that well. Like, he talks about omission, like you can omit things if it's messy, if the story has become messy and there are too many people in the scene, you could kind of remove people. I'm making it sound very bad.
No, I think this is where, again, I would say, if you're interested in this, please go and read the book, because we're giving kind of a brief overview here.
Yeah.
But I liked the honesty with which he talked about lying. He also says, you can't admit things that make you look bad, and right. you can't totally invent things that never happened or places that you weren't, these kinds of things, but you can I guess he's saying it's more about cutting things down than kind of building things up or exaggerating beyond the point of being in touch with reality.
Okay, here's a quote from the book which builds on this, and I really liked and explains the importance of the need to sometimes lie. He says, a great storyteller creates a movie in the minds of the audience. And so things like, for example, me saying it was a very happy moment, or kind of puncture that experience, or so we construct this experience for people, in essence. Like, it's true, but we have to put it in a way that keeps them there. He gives another example of, like, this guy who told a story about rushing through the Miami airport with his daughter. And he said that he was there. He felt the people and the stress and everything until the end, when the guy pulled out the ticket from his pocket and said, like, the ticket is still valid. And he said that moment punctured this suspension of reality for a brief moment.
I agree with what you're saying. That's a really good example, Nicole. I'm glad you said it. I think I want to dwell on that for a second. Possibly, for my own personal benefit, really, and I can do that because it's our podcast. That I realized that this was a habit that I have in the forms of storytelling that I do, to the extent that I do them, of providing a kind of meta narrative. And as you say, saying something like, this was a happy moment, or saying things that comment on events such as, and you'll never guess what happened next. What they do, they take you away from the story, because you are telling the story, even though obviously you're talking about an event that happened in the past, you're describing the events that happened and trying to give the audience the impression that it's unfolding event after event after event. And by providing this sort of meta-narrative, you take them outside of just living those events and put them into kind of event analysis mode, which is quite different. And I thought that that's a really interesting point. And that's certainly something that I have been guilty of in the past. And I think now, if I do that in the future, I would at least do it in a conscious way, knowing that I am, shutting down the cinema of the mind by providing a kind of meta-analysis or meta-commentary. He gave a really, really smart tip as well. He gives examples of don't say these sorts of things because they removed the person from that cinema of the mind experience. But he also said another way to continue the cinema of the mind is to give every single part of the story a physical location. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is it's so simple. And he says this is one of the most simple things, but it makes the biggest difference. So he gives an example of a story where he's describing his grandma as a person. And if we don't have a physical location, we're in this kind of meta-analysis space where we're just like hanging around. You don't know where you are. And it's essentially a voiceover. But he says, imagine the exact same description of the exact same person. But he's saying it, I'm a little boy, I'm 7 years old, and I'm watching my grandma pull weeds out of the garden. She's a person who's like this, she's a person who's like that. That tiny change instantly gives this cinema of the mind experience, because you're with him watching his grandma weed the flower bed. Did we say weed the flower bed?
Yeah, you do, yeah.
Gardening is not my favorite hobby. And then you're learning about the character, but the character is in a physical space, a moment in time.
And what's beautiful about that is the simplicity, as you said. So, he talks about in this particular example how he doesn't really have to describe the garden, and that's not the point. Everybody can picture their own garden. The point is just for you to, in your mind, to have somewhere to place what's happening, which is so simple and so beautiful and so true. I really like that. And the other thing he talks about is present tense, where possible to use present tense, because that makes things active, even if it happened in the past. He has a whole chapter about this and how you can switch between the two, and how people do, and how good storytellers do, and how often if it's an oral story, if you're telling a story, it's harder when you're writing. It's something I actually experimented with, and it is hard, but it is very effective. When you write in present tense, it creates pace and energy. And for stories, that's very, very effective. So those are two very simple, tools that anybody who wants to use stories, I think, could use, inspired by Matthew Dix. One of the things which we haven't really touched on is, stakes. He talks about how, people read because of the stakes in a story. They want to know what's going to happen. Did she say yes? Did they get out of trouble? Did the volcano erupt? I don't know. They want to know,
Yeah, there has to be something at stake that the audience care about that keeps them pulled along with the story.
And so he has I think 5 or 6 tools that you can use to build stakes. So this is once you have the arc of the beginning and the end. So you have your starting point, in other words, your moment, which is your ending. You have how you're going to start your story. Now you need to get this arc, which is where it comes to heightening the stakes. I'll take one that really spoke to me that I thought was very interesting. So to really build this feeling in a narrative in a story, he calls it the hourglass, and it's essentially kind of like cooling things down. So you heighten up the suspense and people's interest, and people are waiting with bated breath to see what's going to happen. And then you slow things down. So you introduce irrelevant, information. And people just want to know. They want to know the answer. They want to know what's going to happen. And you introduce all these other details. They kind of slow things down, but they keep people reading, or they keep people engaged. And so that's called the hourglass. It can be very, very effective.
It kind of goes against certainly a lot of traditional copywriting techniques, because you've managed to raise the stakes such that the audience is desperate to find out what happens next. What's behind the door, this kind of thing. And suddenly he's describing the color of the door, the way that he knocks on the door, the sounds that he hears as he's waiting for the door to open. It's all of this irrelevant information, but he can do that because he has the audience in the palm of his hand, desperate to know what happens. And again, also, it's not that every single story is this kind of life and death story. It's not like he's gonna open the door and there'll be like a tiger behind it ready to pounce on him. It might be that this moment is within the framework of a seemingly normal story about perhaps quite normal mundane events, but using these techniques that he describes in the book, you're able to jack the suspense up so that people really, really care about hearing what happens in your story.
Yeah, and I think I think it's maybe a bit overwhelming. Like when you're reading it, there are a lot of tools. Like I think it isn't always maybe easy, you know, when to apply them or how to apply them. But I think that once you've broken them down, it's essentially easy ways to really get people to engage with your story, which I think is very powerful.
It leads me to a point that I was really curious to discuss with you, Nicole, because he says at the beginning of Storyworthy that there are many reasons why you would want to learn to tell good stories. And he gives examples. Obviously, for him, it's very important as an author, as a participant in the Moth. But he says telling stories effectively will help you to connect better with others, have more meaningful relationships, and so on. But he does give examples of telling stories in businesses too. And I agree that all of his techniques really work to make a beautiful story. But in your opinion, do you think that these techniques would work in terms of copywriting?
It's a good question, and I think it's a very relevant question. You know, we are copywriters. There is a quote that he has in the book that people buy because of stories, not because of numbers, which, you know, obviously he chose it, and it's a quote that fits his narrative. But I do like I don't think necessarily that like it would be the same kind of story. Like it might be just a shorter version or something to hook a reader. But I think that you could apply these techniques to really to hook someone, which is essentially copywriting in some senses. You know, like you're selling without selling. Like I think a lot of this maybe is doing what we do in copywriting. You know, the sense of creating a sense of urgency. What do you think, Sarah?
As I was reading it, I was mentally making a lot of comparisons with Story Brand by Donald Miller, which features in season 1 of the Tried It podcast. You hardcore fans will have already listened to it, but if you're new to the podcast, that's a good episode to go back and listen to, or 2 episodes. With Story, I know I'm going to confuse the names as I'm saying them now, but we're going to roll with it. So with Story Brand, the whole purpose of the book is creating a story for your brand to help consumers understand your brand. And with Storyworthy, Matthew Dix I feel like he's talking about stories more generally. I felt like his techniques were much more applicable to storytelling in the classic sense, not in the sort of brand story sense. So I agree with you, and I think that that's a really good point, Nicole, actually, that there are definitely techniques in there that copywriters can pick out and apply for themselves. But Matthew Dix, essentially, he gives you a framework to create a complete story where he talks about the beginning of the story, the transformation, and he also discusses how to correctly end your story. And I think if you're using storytelling in business, we quite often have the segue or the flip, you know, the switch where you seem like you're telling a story about one thing, and then you suddenly segue into here's how that works in my business, or, you know, here's how my business can help you with that. And Matthew Dick's framework doesn't really have a space for that. And I'm not saying that as a criticism of him or the book, but he
does, though.
He doesn't set out to do that, really.
But he does. He talks about elephants. You know, he talks about elephants can change their colors. He talks about elephants and how the elephant is like the thing that the person goes into a story. Like you set up the story like the elephant in the room for the reader. But then in the story, you do the switch where you change the color of the elephant, that the story actually isn't about the car accident. It's actually about how he discovers that he has friends or something. So you change the elephant. So the flip does happen in his framework. I also...
True. That's a really good point. Yeah.
I also want to say that, like, I actually have used, I don't think to this level because I'm not Matthew Dix, like nowhere near, but I have used this with clients, like not on website copy, but in blog posts, I've used this. In emails, I've used this, like storytelling, not necessarily these techniques. And like, I would like to redo some of my work with these techniques in mind, but like in a very humble way, I want to believe I'm a storyteller at heart. Like, that's what I want to believe I am. I have tons to learn, but like, I do think maybe not for sales pages and maybe not for website copy, because that's kind of odd. But I do think there's room for storytelling in copy. I really do. And I do think like a good blog post or a good email, I think you need stories there.
I agree. It is undeniably one of the best techniques to kind of hook people in. I did I suppose it depends how you position your brand, really, but essentially your brand becomes sort of the 5-second transformation moment. That's the only way that you can have that before state and, you know, the transformation in the end state. So yeah, I can see how it works. It's just, for me, it's less applicable than Donald Miller's story brand framework. And I'm saying that as somebody who didn't particularly like the story brand framework, actually.
Yeah, I also didn't, to be honest. I didn't like it either. Maybe this is more applicable if, let's say, I am a CMO at a company, or anybody at a company, and I have to give a presentation, and this will help me build my narrative or my story. Maybe it's less applicable for copy, you know, for pure hardcore copy, like website copy and stuff like that. Maybe it's more for, I need a blog post, I need a story, I need an email, I have a presentation.
Yeah, it seems much more content marketing, which is very important. It definitely plays a role.
Right.
But it would be way too much for a web page or sales page. It would be too busy, to my way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think you might miss some of the key elements of copy. But, you know, in Matthew Dix's defense, like, he doesn't claim to be a copywriter. He's a writer.
That's a really good point. And I think overall, it did seem to me that he was much more helping other people to tell stories from their life, to connect better with the people around them, which I think is a really, really important thing. It's especially nowadays where people get more divided, being able to speak confidently and competently based on your own personal experience it's a huge skill. I have to say, though, when I was kind of running through my mind of, you know, different things I've done, and with this framework of, you know, the before state, after state, and the 5-second transformation, it kind of made me think, do I have a single story, a Matthew Dix capital S story in my life? I think my life has just been a series of weird anecdotes.
No, you moved countries. That's a huge story.
Yeah, but does that count as a 5-second transformation? I mean, for one thing, the flight is longer than 5 seconds.
Yes, but Matthew Dix would say you need to dig deeper. You need to find, like, maybe you know, like, the reason you left. Like, it's kind of like therapy. You know, like, I also moved countries. I can find a 5-minute moment in that.
Yeah,
5 seconds.
It's true.
5 minutes.
Yeah, 5-minute moment
would be
longer, a bit more complicated.
But, you know, I think that's what maybe drew me to the book as well. Is that, like, it's like a gift to yourself, this book. Like, if you take, I'm not talking about, like, the tools to actually, you know, build the story arc and that kind of thing. I'm talking about the finding the moments. It's really a gift to yourself, and it's a different way, I think, of looking at your life. And I think, like, as copywriters and people who are working and trying to essentially infuse emotion in our work to get people to feel something, that's what we need, you know. I mean, like, if you take walking outside, like, when you walk outside, how much do we actually notice? Like, how many small moments pass us by? And, like, you're not going to infuse that in your copy, but, like, I feel like if we were more heightened to things around us, it might make us better copywriters.
Yes, he clearly has a very attuned lens to people, to feelings, to human experience, and that's a very useful thing to have, useful in many senses.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the book. Look, I love his writing, but I really enjoyed the book, and I think that this is the book you come to, not necessarily to hone your copywriting skills, but, like, to hone aspects of the craft, really. And, like, if you're feeling, like, dusty, like, your writing skills are feeling dusty, and you feel like you've fallen out of love with writing, and, like, it's become a schlep and, like, a chore, I would recommend this book.
Is that possibly the strongest endorsement we've had on the podcast, I think?
Listen, I'm super biased. I listen to the Muff podcast. I follow, like, him and his wife. They have a Speak Up. They have their own podcast. I don't think they've updated in a while. I'm a super hardcore fan. Anyway.
With that said, with that ringing endorsement, which I don't dispute, you know, maybe it's one of those books that means more to you than to me, but I still really like it. Maybe with all of that said, we move on to talking about our implementation points, the things that we want to take from Storyworthy to apply in our own lives. And I feel like you maybe reading between the lines gave us a tantalizing preview, Nicole. Was I correct?
Yes. No, you're very, very correct. So my first one, no surprise, is I really want to give Homework for Life a go. I think like it requires commitment, and it reminds me of one of my implementation tasks for 4,000 weeks, which was this jar filled with these Post-it notes where every day my family and I would kind of similar idea, like record these moments that made our day special. And I really found it a beneficial experience. So I really want to try and give this a go.
Do you think that you'll, perhaps I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but do you think you will take some of those Homework for Life moments and turn into stories, or for you is the focus more just trying to install the habit of Homework for Life with no ulterior motive as of yet?
So I think more than a copywriter, I want to be a writer, to be honest with you. I think like that's my real love. So I think there is an ulterior motive, unfortunately. Like it's not just connecting stories, which it's also beautiful. But then the other element for me is that as I've mentioned before, I'm pivoting. And part of my pivot involves aspects of storytelling that I want to try and incorporate in my business. So it's part of that as well. Like it goes with where I'm going.
Nice. So implementation point number 1, Homework for Life. And number 2?
My other one, I don't know if this is allowed. It builds on it. Like I want to try Crash and Burn as well. Is that okay? Like to do 2 that are very similar? I don't know.
It's our podcast. We make the rules.
Okay, cool. So that
tried it, says yes, you may.
Okay, great. So Crash and Burn. And then my third one is, again, I'm pivoting and I'm working on my new website, which should be up hopefully soon. And the copy is mostly written. And I've actually got a few stories on the website. Like the website is very, very different and breaks many of the traditional copywriting rules. And I want to go through it with this lens of the stuff we've learned on the podcast and sharpen the stories. For example, my about page on my website is basically a story. I think it falls flat for many reasons. I don't think the stakes are high enough. I don't think it has a 5-second moment. I don't think the beginning is strong enough. Like I want to rework a lot of my website copy with the lens of this book in mind.
It sounds amazing. I love the idea of pulling in techniques from not only this book, but from other books we read on the podcast as well.
What about you, Sarah?
My implementation points. So surprise, surprise. My implementation point number 1 is also Homework for Life. Because I think I want to just have that practice, and I do like the idea of just having somewhere to like store kind of random little memories. And I think I've been looking for something like that for a while, and I quite like the structure of Homework for Life. Whether or not I'll be able to do it continuously, I don't know, but that's not what we're here for, to think about what we're going to do until the end of time. I'm going to try and do it every day from now until we record our next episode, and then we'll see from there. Like I said, I think the idea is intriguing, and it keeps making me think. Maybe like 10 days or so ago, I was walking on a busy street not too far from where I live, and I saw a youngish guy walking down the street carrying a full bowl of soup. And I was just like, what are you doing? Just how has life brought you to this point where you're carefully carrying what look like quite a hot and a very full bowl of soup down the middle of the street? And right now I don't have anywhere to keep that memory, and Homework for Life is somewhere to put things like that.
Right. No, I mean that's a beautiful moment. Very bizarre.
Yeah. Oh, soup man, where are you now? What has become of you and your full bowl of soup? Okay, so that's my implementation point number 1, Homework for Life. Implementation point number 2, I have tried for a while to write down other things that I was calling stories from my life as kind of a sort of creative writing exercise, but also just, for kind of memories, that sort of thing. Sometimes I write about people in my family who, are no longer with us, and it's a nice way of keeping them alive in my mind. But having read Storyworthy, and now like, okay, well, I don't think these count as stories because they don't have the Matthew Dix framework. So I want to go back at and look at some of these sort of creative writing exercises that I have been doing. Well, I say have been doing. It's been a while since I've done them. And see if I can tweak it to include some of the Matthew Dix techniques, such as the cinema of the mind, giving everything a location, and stakes and the change of state, to see if they could be a story more than just a sort of kind of verbal portrait of somebody I know or some thing that happened to me at some point. And I'm kind of doing it out of curiosity to see, are they really stories or not, you know?
I mean, it sounds fascinating, and I'm curious to see what you think of the before and after.
The before and after in the story, or the before and after of the story, like how it is now versus how it is once I've Matthew Dixified it.
Yeah, like I'm curious to see the transformation that you make within the story.
Yeah, I think some of them lend themselves more to being story-worthy than others. There's one that I feel like I wrote it very well, as in, I think that I described the events very well, and I think that it was really an interesting exercise for me to get into in terms of just honing my writing muscles. But I can't see how it would be a story-worthy story with the transformation and everything. So yeah, I'm curious to see where it goes, you know?
Very cool.
Thank you. So that's implementation point number 2. And implementation point number 3 is to use these storytelling elements in some sort of communication, which I'm thinking will be an email for my list, or maybe a post on LinkedIn, or it might be both, but adapted to each platform. I don't know if my implementation points 2 and 3 will be the same story. So it might be 2 different ones. Anyway, because it's the Tried It podcast and we are honest and open about things, I will share links to these in the show notes, but of the next episode, not of this one, because I ain't done it yet.
No, that sounds very, very interesting. Like, I'm curious to see, and to do it on client work. No, you don't want to go there.
I don't know that this particular framework would be useful for client work. Certainly not the kind of client work that I'm doing now. It could be in the future. And I would say to other copywriters, you know, why not try this out on your client work? So I'm not saying no forever. I'm saying right now I can't see how that would translate exactly.
No, fair enough. I think it's a bit of a leap. Like, I think it requires a specific kind of client work to work.
Exactly, and I don't have that right now. If somebody listening does try it out on client work, please let us know how it goes. We would genuinely love to know.
Yeah. Or if you have tried it already, like if you've read this book, if you have thoughts on the book or feelings about the book, or tried it on, we'd love to hear.
Yes. Our email address is in the show notes. So, pop us a little email and let us know.
Yeah. I'm wondering if maybe now is a good time to talk about our membership.
I think this is the best time to talk about our membership, Nicole.
I mean, every moment, all the time is a good time to talk about the membership, but now is also a good moment. So,
what's the title of the Matthew Dix book? Someday is today. Sometime is now time for membership talk time.
Exactly. Yes, 100%, definitely. So yeah, our membership is very cool. It's basically your opportunity in 13 minutes a week to become a better copywriter. And it's like having one of the great copywriters of the world as your personal coach. And we say that because we draw on the books of these books that we're reading, and we use these books to create, prompts and exercises that you can implement in your business to improve your craft, to hone your copywriting skills, and to hopefully in 13 minutes a week or less become a better copywriter.
Yes. So when you sign up to the membership, you will get this weekly email with the exercise in and some other thoughts about copy, or reflections from copywriting books that Nicole and I are reading, for the podcast now or for future podcast episodes. So that was like a fun little preview of what's coming up on the Tried It podcast. Other membership benefits include, but are not limited to, exclusive bonus content recorded by Nicole and I for members' ears only, And we offer our members the opportunity to vote on which books we will read next on the podcast. So if you want to feel like you're part of the Try to experience, if you have a stack of copywriting books which you've started but not finished, or want some help of how to apply copywriting books that you've read to your client work, then you can vote on them. And if the book gets enough votes, it will be featured in a future episode of the podcast. If you'd like to have any more information about the membership, you will find the link to our website in the show notes, so you can peruse it at your leisure.
And we hope to see you then. And if not, we still love you, and we still appreciate you listening, especially if you made it this far.
Yes. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And there are other free ways that you can support us if you're strapped for cash right now. You could support us by subscribing to the podcast, or sharing an episode that you have enjoyed with somebody that you know that you think would also enjoy it. These are the things that really help the podcast to grow. So that is always an option.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Nicole, for reading the book with me. And we will rendezvous here for our implementation episode once we have fully implemented. So I guess with all of that said, we have had our before state. We're heading towards the after state. And I think we're signing off here at the 5-second transformation moment. I don't think I did that right.
No, you did. You did.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Guys.
Bye.
Bye.